It is 11 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Time once again for Southern Fried Sports on your home for University of Alabama Athletics. Travis Reier, Senior Analyst for BamaOnline.com, with you each and every weekday morning from 11 a.m. until noon. The show is always brought to you by Peterbrook Chocolatier out there at 1530 McFarland Boulevard North in the Indian Hills section of Tuscaloosa. Jam-packed program for you on this Tuesday. You've got a lot of action going on off Bryant Drive later today. The Alabama baseball team hosting South Alabama. That's a 3 o'clock first pitch as the undefeated 12-0 Crimson Tide will look to make it a lucky 13 to start the 2020 campaign coming up this afternoon. That, of course, will be followed by men's basketball action at Coleman Coliseum, 7:30 tip, as the Alabama Crimson Tide welcomes the 1-15 in conference play Vanderbilt Commodores to Coleman. Senior night, Beetle Bolden, Alabama's lone senior, will be honored in the pregame leading up to Alabama Vandy tonight over at Coleman Coliseum. Coming up next, Brent Beard joins us as we get things going on a Tuesday edition of Southern Fried Sports right after this.
100.9. For more coverage of Alabama football, visit us at Tide100.9.com or download the free Tide 100.9 app.
The Crimson Tide will not be denied.
Back with more of a Tuesday edition of Southern Fried Sports, right? Tide 100.9 FM. Travis Reier, Senior Analyst for BamaOnline.com, with you each and every weekday morning from 11 a.m. until noon. And just like clockwork, our pal, Brent Beard of College Sports Today and First Coast News, joins us on this Tuesday as we go around the Southeastern Conference and beyond with Brent, who does an outstanding job covering college football, some college hoops as well, kind of having a meshing of the two sports here in the very near future, Brent, as we wind down. We get into March Madness from the hoops perspective, but lo and behold, here in the last day or so, Brent, pigskins starting to fly around, spring football coming online in different locales around the country.
I'll tell you what, it's an amazing time of year in the Travis. Basketball, baseball, and spring football is starting to crank up. So I love this time, but you're right. We're already getting a smattering of teams starting spring practice.
Yeah, it's Miami here in the last day or so.
Yeah,
I saw Ohio State cranking things up in Columbus. You're going to have Alabama. I didn't know what you thought of this with all the injury luck, bad luck that Alabama's had. Alabama going to crank it up on Friday the 13th. That's just kind of the way it falls because Nick likes to throw in that one practice on Friday before he sends the boys on spring break, before they head to Cancun and play other destinations.
Trav, I'm just guessing that before they leave, he will address their behavior and expect it to be supreme. Well, would that be an understatement?
Well, Nick will try to tell you, look, it's just an opportunity to kind of give these guys a chance to get reacquainted and give them a little bit of an opportunity to get their feet wet before we really crank it up coming back. I don't know if I necessarily buy all of that. I'm kind of with you in that at least part of the purpose of having that single practice before spring break is to, just kind of not so subtly let the guys know that what awaits them when they get back from those cruises and everything else they're going to do.
And I'm guessing that there may be something mentioned in there about to continue your conditioning, or you'll be paying for it that first day back, right?
Yeah. Well, they're going to do curls on spring break. They're just going to be of the 12-ounce variety for a lot of the fellas,
Right. Yeah.
And speaking of curls, I wanted to get your thoughts on this situation, as we've talked about here for the last couple of days now, involving the strength and conditioning post, and it appears as if Alabama is going to sort of take the two-headed approach to it now moving forward, with David Ballou coming in from the University of Indiana, and also his cohort there when it comes to strength and conditioning, more so maybe from a speed enhancement and performance and kinesiology and those type of things with Dr. Matt Reier. What did you think of that, Brent, when you first heard?
Well, I'm fascinated by it. I'm certainly not surprised. I think we'd start to see Saban getting some cutting edge guys who are really into the kinesiology and the sciences. And I tell you what, I'm even more fascinated with this speed guy in Ray than I am Ballou. I mean, obviously they're quite a package. And look, we don't know them that well, but I think for what we've seen and what we've read, I think both of them are pretty impressive. And Nick Saban, being who he is, Trav, is usually at least 2 steps ahead of the competition. So and with that new sports science building coming up, it sounds like it's going to be a great combination, doesn't it?
It's been an interesting offseason to this point. You've got another defensive line coach coming in here in Freddie Roach. You've acquired the services of Charlie Strong as an analyst. And here in the last day or so, I guess it's been reported that Mike Stoops, who appeared to have been headed to work with his brother up at Kentucky in some capacity, not sure what exactly, is apparently going to hang around Tuscaloosa for the time being. Nick can't get these analysts to even leave anymore. Look at Butch. Butch is now the special assistant.
Really? That's right.
Nick Saban. I know he's still getting that big buyout, but once that buyout runs out, I don't know. Could they pay you enough for that job, to be Nick Saban's right-hand man? I would think that would be a pretty demanding job that Butch is about to or that Butch has undertook there. I'm fascinated by whatever special assistant may mean. But I'll say this, and when I've heard about Butch, Trav, and I'm interested if you've heard the same thing, that Butch is a tremendous talent evaluator. He may be as good in that as anybody. Now, where Butch gets off the rails is if you get brick by brick type stuff and to get into motivation and mantras and things like that. But as far as talent, he is on the next level with that. And again, I think we know that these guys being in there, and I really love that strong hire for them, is they basically kind of reinvent themselves along the way. And listen, you and I use this word all the time, and it's obvious he's got a real trust for Butch Jones by now, doesn't he? Yeah, and look, we have fun with Butch. A lot of people do. But there's a reason why at one point the guy was the head football coach at the University of Tennessee. And again, you can say, well, so was Derek Dooley, and so were some other guys. But he climbed the ranks, no doubt about it. A couple of group of 5 type stops and, pushed his way into that spot and really had Tennessee in a position there about 3 or 4 years into it that you thought that program was getting ready to turn the corner. It did not happen. And so here Butch is, it looks like, for another year with the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, we are getting closer to the pretty much outright start of spring football across the Southeastern Conference. What we do know, too, is that we're going to have spring games before you know it. I mean, Vanderbilt getting an early start, so the Commodores are going to lead things off in the SEC with their spring game on April the 3rd. South Carolina the very next day going to hold its spring game at Williams-Brice Stadium in Columbia on April the 4th. Then that weekend of the 11th, you're going to have Auburn here in state. That game, that scrimmage will air on ESPN2, Kentucky, Mississippi State, and Missouri, also on Saturday, April the 11th. And then a big, big Saturday, LSU, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Ole Miss all going to hold their spring scrimmages on that Saturday, April the 18th. I want to take a look at a couple of 3 of these teams, and I'm going to ask you, Brent, for your biggest question for these teams that we touch on today. What about South Carolina? Does it continue to be the quarterback situation? The health of Helinski, I guess, going into the spring, had that knee issue. The status of Will Muschamp, Mike Bobo coming in as the offensive coordinator. Which one of the topics sort of strike you the most with South Carolina?
Well, I combine it again with them. It's offense, and what is Will going to allow Mike Bobo to do? I think we both have a trust. Use that word again for Bobo and what he is capable of doing with them. And if Helinski is healthy, that's going to be quite interesting. Now, what I understand, Trav, is that they have moved Daquan Joyner from quarterback to his natural position as a wide receiver. And one of the things for them is they have struggled over the years, and they may have a Debo Samuel from time to time, but they don't have 3 or 4 of them, do they?
So Brian Edwards too, don't they?
That's right. Yeah. And Joyner, I think, is going to help them. So, and again, Trev, they're at that point where and they'll deny it, and he'll deny it. I think this is do or die for them this year. That they've got to be an improved football team. I know the schedule last year was brutal, and we get all that. But man, to do that for them, they've got to be better on offense, don't they?
They do. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And then they lose their alpha dog on defense and Javon Kinlaw, and he's not the only departure they're going to have, I think, from that front. So you still got question marks for that team across the board, and you just wonder if it might end up being a little too late with Mike Bobo coming in there to try to rectify those issues on the offensive side of the ball. Now, that spring game for the Gamecocks, that's April the 4th, a Saturday. The next Saturday, you talk about, of all the SEC teams, maybe the most anticipated spring game might be in Starkville, Mississippi.
Yeah, absolutely.
With Mike Leach doing his thing on that Saturday, April the 11th. I show that as being a SEC Network Plus, kind of a streaming situation. How is the Pirates spring game debut
really?
going to at least be on ESPNU or SEC Network? And maybe some of this is still being sorted out. Maybe some of these scrimmages are actually going to fall that way. But yeah, I mean, you're going to have Mississippi State and Auburn on the same day. And typically you would say, well, Auburn's obviously going to be the focal point on that particular Saturday. But I think even more eyes are going to be on Leach and the Bulldogs.
Well, and I think what they may be able to get out of KJ Costello too, right? Listen, I'm convinced that Leach could, and Gardner Minshew is a great example of this, isn't it, Travis? Of what he can do with a quarterback. Is nothing but fascinating. So I think a lot of people would like to see that game. I mean, Auburn's on ESPN2, and the rest of them are on ESPN or SEC Plus. Now, my understanding is what the league's going to do is they're going to have a lot of whip around type situations. But I think once you land on State, you got to watch him for a while.
Yeah, and I think Costello actually doesn't get to Starkville until June. I think he has to finish up his degree at Stanford this spring. But still, Garrett Schrader, kind of the forgotten guy in all of this. Right. The guy who last fall looked like he was very much a slam dunk to be the next full-time starting quarterback. You had Tommy Stevens come in as the grad transfer du jour in 2019 under Joe Moorhead. That certainly had its peaks and more so valleys, I think we would agree. Garrett Schrader sees a lot of playing time as a true freshman. Now you go through the change with Mike Leach coming in, KJ Costello coming in, the grad transfer from Stanford. He'll be there this summer. So an opportunity for Garrett Schrader to perhaps big picture-wise sort of establish himself, perhaps if it isn't so much in 2020, then certainly in 2021. Talk about Auburn. And I guess we got to start on the defensive side of the ball, which we haven't really had to do the last couple of years because guys like Derek Brown, Marlon Davidson, Nick Coe, they've been fixtures for the last couple of years. But is that where you'll have your sort of attention fixed on this team, at least during spring drills?
I think the two things I'm looking for would be the defensive line and where are they going to be. I think they've got the bodies at running back, don't they, Trav? But who's going to take the lead in that situation? Those are the two areas that I've got to look at, and I think be able to see where that's going to go for them. So I think we both like Nix a lot, and they've still got a lot of questions again now. But without rambling too much about Auburn, their beat writers would tell you, Trav, they still have not recruited well on the offensive line.
Yeah.
And in the beat writers' mind that we've talked to, that they still have as many questions there as they do anywhere else.
Yeah, and that's probably the reality of the situation. As much as the star power will need to be replaced in that defensive front, Auburn was still very, very mediocre to average at best along that offensive line in 2019. So as far as that team's championship type hopes in 2020, that may have as much or more to do with those chances as even the defensive side of the ball. Talking with Brent Beard of College Sports Today and First Coast News on a Tuesday edition of Southern Fried Sports. Then we're going to move into that next Saturday, April the 18th. Man, you're going to have LSU. That's going to be an ESPN2 broadcast. I think LSU's kind of like Alabama. Does LSU have some stadium stuff going on? Because I want to say I saw something about LSU having to sort of move its spring game.
Trav, you're right. They're moving it to Southern, aren't they?
Yeah, right there in Baton Rouge.
And oh, by the way, they're getting too many drunk students, Trav, breaking into that stadium at night. So I think security might be an issue over there too.
Yeah. So you're gonna have LSU, you're gonna have Florida. All of these scrimmages kind of within the same window. LSU, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia tentatively set for kickoffs within the hour of each other. Tennessee a little bit later in the afternoon. Texas A&M going to go with a primetime spring game, as will Lane Kiffin. Man, the Grove. Will the Grove for a spring game be rocking on April the 18th before the Rebels conduct their spring game at Vaught Hemingway Stadium?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, Lane will certainly be, I think, in rare form at that point. And again, like Leach, it's going to be fascinating to see what he's able to do with this group that is able to come back. So and again, I know all eyes are going to be on that offense, but I still want to know about who is coming back defensively and what he's going to do with that group.
Yeah, if we had to pick a first-team all-SEC quarterback going into spring practice, Brent, which way do you go with that? Is it Kyle Trask of Florida? Is it Kellen Mond? Is it Bo Nix? Who's your first-team guy?
I would go with Trask. I really like Trask and what he did last year. He knows this is it for him. I think he's earned that spot. And I tell you, Trav, we mentioned LSU a minute ago. In that Florida LSU game, I know he made a few mistakes, but they didn't lose that game on Trask. So Trask had them in that game and even ahead in the middle of the third quarter in that national championship LSU team. So my real quick answer for that would be Trask. And Trav, I'm not sure if I had to pick a number two. Frankly, if it may not be to some degree, Mac Jones would get heavy consideration for me.
Highest rated returning passer in the SEC coming back. And, we're leaving out the SEC Freshman of the Year for 2019 in Bo Nix. But, it's interesting, right? Because a year ago at this time, we were all convinced it was either Tua Tagovailoa
Right.
or Jake Fromm, and here
Correct.
comes Joe Burrow, who not only is your first-team All-SEC quarterback, but just wins the Heisman Trophy while he's at it. And, of course,
Yeah.
Tua, the injuries were a big part of that, or it would have been an even better run there, I would say, for that sort of designation. Hey, Brent, is it too early to talk about the biggest games of the college football season
Never.
for 2020? I know our crew at 247sports.com recently released the most anticipated games for the 2020 regular season. Ohio State at Oregon, I believe that's a week 2. Georgia at Alabama, that's into the month of September here in Tuscaloosa. Clemson at Notre Dame, I believe that's a November
It is. That's
matchup.
correct.
Maybe the same weekend as Alabama at LSU, I want to say. So when you consider Clemson's candidacy for yet another trip to the college football playoff, when you look at Clemson's schedule for 2020, it looks like the road game at Notre Dame or a shoe-in once again for Dabo
That's
Swinney
it.
in the college football playoff.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that, and they get a lot of criticism for that. I know they're saying they're playing Georgia soon, or as far as next year is concerned, but for this year, I don't think there's any question about that they're going to get a lot of criticism with that. And Trev, that Ohio State-Oregon game is, after last year, and watching them, particularly against Utah, and I thought they really had an argument to a degree on maybe even getting into the Final Four. To me, Oregon's, and we meant speaking of strength and conditioning, I think that's a little more tougher physical team than they have been in a while. I think that could be a pretty tough game for Ohio State. Still think Ohio State has the better athlete, but could Oregon be a lot more physical with them than they would have been, say, 2, 3, 4 years ago?
Yeah, I'd say Oregon under Mario Cristobal, that would be more the case than Oregon under Chip Kelly, put it
No
that
doubt.
way. And so, yeah, that's a nice matchup there early in the season, and I like it because it's a true road game. You know, it's not neutral. It's very much a true road game for the Buckeyes at Autzen out there in Eugene. So absolutely, that's one that the eyes of college football will be transfixed on, that matchup between the Bucks and the Ducks. A sneaky one because Texas didn't live up to it. Certainly after falling to LSU and Austin, is that return game for the Longhorns at LSU. I think we're going to find out if, we still see Texas mentioned in early top 10s for 2020. The expectation LSU is going to take a bit of a dip. And I also thought it was interesting that of this top 10, no USC, Alabama in the top 10 on that list.
Yeah, and it would have to be just outside that list. And Trev, what about if Bama beats Georgia and Tuscaloosa? At that point, will that Georgia-Florida game, if they go into that game with the East Division title on the line, and it certainly could be, I think will the Gators be in a fever pitch at that point?
I think they're going to be regardless of what happens in Tuscaloosa. But if Alabama beats Georgia, especially, and Georgia goes into Jacksonville with at least one loss, the Gator fans are going to want to get that thing done against the Bulldogs and take a big step towards clinching that SEC division crown and making their way to Atlanta. Well, Brent, as always, appreciate your time here on the program. Brent Beard, staple of Southern Fried Sports, and you hear him elsewhere as well. Great work as always, Brent. Look forward to doing it again next week.
And Travis, I go prayers for the family of Coach Corky Rogers at the Bowl School, who will always be one of the greatest coaches that you and I are familiar with. You more than me, but I'm telling you, if people ever wanted to see a high school version of Nick Saban, I think it will be Coach Rogers. Don't you?
I would agree wholeheartedly with that. I've been around a lot of coaches, and there's two that I put on a pedestal. And one is Corky Rogers, the all-time winningest high school football coach in state of Florida history. The other, Madonna Thompson, women's basketball coach at Shelton State here in Tuscaloosa. I've been around a lot of coaches. The ones that I've been around more than probably others, those are the two. Those are the two I put on the pedestal, no doubt about it. Corky Rogers will be missed.
And Trav, let me say this real quick. I heard Tommy Hilliard, who was the starting center on that team that should have won the state championship when unfortunately quarterback Chris Reier got hurt that game, but he told a story, Trav, that I think summed it up. He said he would go fishing with Corky from time to time, and he said there was one time that, and help me on the numbers here, on the famous play call, but he said I was reeling in this big bass, and I almost got it on the boat, and from out of nowhere, Coach Rogers said, Hilliard, which way do you pull on that 51 trap?
Yeah, it was 50 trap. Corky didn't miss it, no doubt about it.
No.
Well, hey, Brent, thanks a lot. As always, my man. We'll do it again next week.
Look forward to it, pal. Take care.
There he goes, Brent Beard of First Coast News and College Sports Today. Back with more. We're going to get position-specific with this Alabama football team coming up on Southern Fried Sports. And we're back with more of Southern Fried Sports right here on Tide 100.9 FM. Travis Reier, senior analyst for BamaOnline.com. You know the spiel at this point. You've been around. You've listened to the program for the nearly 4 years it's been in existence. We're with you each and every weekday morning from 11 a.m. until noon. The show, as always, brought to you by Peterbrook Chocolatier. We got to start getting a little bit position specific, don't we? You've got spring football practice right around the corner. Nick Saban just sort of mocking superstition, huh? Alabama with this horrible injury luck, going to do it anyway. Going to crank up spring drills. That's right, on Friday the 13th, coming up in just a couple weeks now, less than a couple weeks. Nick likes to put the boys through that Friday before spring break workout. You know, give them a chance to sort of get their feet wet in the procedural aspect of practice. It also helps those young guys. Going to be a lot of early enrollees out there, some that are going to be highly visible, like Bryce Young, like Will Anderson, like Drew Sanders. Yeah, you're going to be all over that first practice on Friday the 13th if you're an Alabama fan. But what we're going to get into right now is offensive line play. And when you look at it as a whole, and we're going to talk more about the interior of this Alabama offensive line with you this morning. When you look at this group as a whole, yes, you lose a major piece to the 2019 puzzle in Jedrick Wills. And by the way, Jedrick Wills, as we talked about, very impressive last week and over the weekend, into the weekend, at the 2020 NFL Scouting Combine. Jedrick Wills looks to have made absolutely the correct decision in moving on to the Sunday game. Looks to be, at this point, a slam dunk first-round draft pick. Nice measurables, ran well, showed off the C4 in his hands, popping those pads with those offensive line coach in position drills up there in Indianapolis. So good for Jedrick Wills, about to cash some big checks up there in the National Football League. But where does that leave Alabama moving forward? And whereas we'll talk about the interior offensive line with you right now, a lot of it seemingly will depend on how things shake out at right tackle. Is this going to be a continuation of what we've seen in recent years, where highly regarded offensive tackle prospects come in? Evan Neal is who we're talking about, obviously. Evan Neal comes in as a part of the 2019 recruiting class. He's the number 1 rated offensive tackle for that cycle. Comes in, works at offensive tackle, but ultimately ends up as Alabama's every game starter at left guard, similar to what we saw with Alex Leatherwood. Now, Leatherwood as a freshman was predominantly a tackle. I mean, you saw him in the 2018 College Football Playoff National Championship game. When Jonah Williams went down with the injury early in the second half there against the Georgia Bulldogs, it was Leatherwood who jumped in there and performed reasonably well enough, given the situation, given his lack of experience, given the size of that stage and the magnitude of that football game. Leatherwood survived it. Was he dominant? No. Was he a deer in the headlights? Of course he wasn't. He was fine. Ultimately, he moves inside for the 2018 season, becomes next-door neighbors with Jedrick Wills, his classmate there on the right side, before jumping back out to left tackle for the 2019 campaign. So when you connect dots and you consider the backgrounds of these guys, you know, it's not all that uncommon to get the best 5 on the field. And whereas we talk so much about continuity in offensive line play, we hear more from Nick Saban about what? What do we hear more from Nick Saban about? We don't hear about continuity as much. We hear about getting the best 5 on the field. And that's what Alabama has essentially done, bringing in offensive tackles. And if it works out that right now, perhaps earlier in their careers, they can benefit this team, this program more at guard, that's what we've seen happen. Continuity is for Kyle Flood to figure out. That's what Nick Saban's paying Kyle Flood big money for. You know, he wants his best 5 players on the field. He wants his best players on the field regardless of position. As far as continuity and all that, that's on the position coach. And so we saw that most recently with Evan Neal. But again, if the expectation is that Evan Neal will now go out to right tackle with Jedrick Wills moving on, well, that makes for some potentially interesting scenarios. For an interior that last year between Dickerson, Neal, Deontay Brown coming back from suspension after sitting out the first 4 games of the 2019 season, that was sort of a carryover, as we know, from the playoff the previous year, 6 games total. Chris Owens opened the season as your starting center and went on to start 4 games for you in 2019. But ultimately, with Owens getting nicked up a little bit, Brown coming back from suspension, it worked out that Dickerson jumped in at that center position. Evan Neal was your every game guy at left guard. And then Deontay Brown was your starter over the final 8 games of the 2013 season. Worked out to be a really, really good group, especially in the run game. Now, with Dickerson's experience at multiple positions, including guard just this past season to go along with center, you know, there are some scenarios where Dickerson could move if it benefits this group in its totality. Is Darian Dalcourt going into his second year in the program? Is he going to prove too good to keep off the field at the center position? Well, if he does, potentially you go with Darian Dalcourt at center, Deontay Brown at a guard, and Landon Dickerson at a guard with Evan Neal at right tackle. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? But again, that's not the only options that Kyle Flood has at his disposal going into spring practice. Now, there's also the potential for just leaving Landon Dickerson at center, Deontay Brown at guard, Evan Neal at right tackle, and then Emil Ekiyor, one of these experienced guys that have been around for a couple of 3 years now. Emil Ekiyor, at various stages of the 2019 season, he was your next guy in there at the guard position. Also has some experience at center, as a matter of fact. So you've got some versatility there when you look at these positions. And got to give a lot of credit. I know that it wasn't always the cleanest of group in terms of penalties, certainly. The Auburn game, the second half, the fourth quarter, what was there? 5 false starts in the fourth quarter of the Auburn game alone last season. That is, you think Nick Saban has emphasized that to Kyle Flood and those guys? since the end of the season. Got to clean it up. Got to clean up the penalties for sure. That was a major problem. Jedrick Wills had his issues too, but it was really from tackle to tackle. Alabama struggled with the penalty. So that's priority number one as much as anything. Physically and in terms of talent, there is still plenty here. I mean, you've got enough depth here at these interior spots. Even last season, you were able to take Kendall Randolph, a veteran, redshirt junior, heading into the 2020 season. You were able to take Chris Owens once you decided that Landon Dickerson was your guy at center. You were able to take those guys and put tight end numbers on them and play them as extra offensive linemen essentially at the tight end position. You've got young guys that you still need to consider in all this too. You know, Darian Dalcourt, Evan Neal. They got a pretty talented classmate in Pierce Quick, who's a versatile dude in his own right, redshirt freshman, that when you talk about that 2019 recruiting cycle, Pierce Quick as a recruit was rated as highly as, well, not quite Evan Neal, but certainly Darian Dalcourt. So there is quality numbers. There isn't just a depth of scholarship players, and you're going to have an early enrollee in Seth McLaughlin coming over from Buford High School in Georgia that's joining that mix for spring practice. He's probably more of a developmental guy, and that's the benefit of how Alabama was able to knock it out of the park in the 2019 cycle. Alabama isn't going to be dependent upon newcomers in 2020 to step in and do some things like we've seen in the past from Jonah Williams or Cam Robinson. There isn't that type of need. You know, they got time with these 2020 guys to develop them at a reasonable pace. If one or two of them prove to be advanced and ready to see the field as a top 7 type in that rotation, great. But there isn't the urgency on these young guys as there's been in the past with a couple that we've noted, specifically more so probably at tackle than even guard, although again you saw it with Evan Neal stepping in there at left guard last season. So scenarios out there for you: Landon Dickerson at center or guard, Darian Dalcourt, does he jump in there at center? You know, there is still going to be competition at tackle regardless. You know, Evan Neal makes the most sense, but there are guys coming back like Tommy Brown at tackle that can at least compete, even with Scott Lashley taking the grad transfer route back home to Mississippi State. You know, there are guys that we're not going to talk about enough. Amari Kite, where's he at in his development? Is he going to be ready to push maybe at offensive tackle? There are going to be guys that are capable of certainly competing there. But if you're just connecting dots and you're going on sort of historic data in relation to how things have worked, even in recent years, Evan Neal at right tackle makes sense in large part because you have so much quality depth inside. You know, you can feel fine about moving him out to right tackle and knowing that regardless of how it shakes out from guard to guard, you're still going to be in really good shape. And that's important because you're transitioning to a new quarterback. And whereas Mac Jones showed you some really good things, a lot of production in the 4 starts that he made a season ago, this still might be a team, at least early on, that rides Najee Harris a little bit more from the outset of the season than Alabama did with Tua Tagovailoa at quarterback either of the last 2 years. And regardless of which way it goes from guard to guard, I think Alabama's going to have the ability to do that just fine. In terms of potentially dominant offensive lines, especially in the run game, the combinations here sort of line up to that being the case in 2020. Going to step aside for another break. When we come back, more of Southern Fried Sports right here on Tide 100.9 FM right after. It is Southern Fried Sports right here on Tide 100.9 FM. Travis Reier, senior. Comes with an AARP card, in case you're wondering, once they give you that title. Senior analyst for BamaOnline.com, part of the 247sports.com network. Hey, let's talk some outside linebacker position at the University of Alabama. If you got a minute or two, We'll talk some OLBs. Actually, if you're an Alabama fan, you may not want to hear much of this because, a lot of production walking out that door. Anthony Jennings, Terrell Lewis. You saw them. You saw them over the weekend up there at the NFL Scouting Combine. These two guys in 2019 combined to produce 24 tackles for loss, 16 sacks, and 24 quarterback hurries. Now, typically when you've had that type of production move on, there's been at least a guy or two at outside linebacker going into the following spring practice that you felt like, yeah, we can identify that these two or three guys are going to be more than capable replacements. For the first time in the Nick Saban, perhaps, era at Alabama, I can't really tell you that looking at outside linebacker. In terms of returning candidates, and when we talk about returning candidates at outside linebacker for Alabama, we're talking about Christopher Allen, Ben Davis, King Wakuda, Jerez Parks, Kevin Harris II. That's what we're talking about at outside linebacker. And you know how many sacks and quarterback hurries Alabama got out of those four guys last year, because Kevin Harris redshirted. Allen, Davis, Makuta, Parks all saw the field. Between those four guys in 2019, 1.5 sacks and 3 quarterback hurries. That's what you're bringing back. When you're talking about just combined totals in general for those 4 players, 21 total tackles, 6.5 for loss, 1.5 sacks, and 5 quarterback hurries during their Alabama careers, not during the 2019 season. We're talking about careers. And this isn't just 3 or 4 guys. This isn't 3 or 4 guys that are going into their second years in the program. Ben Davis is a redshirt senior. Christopher Allen's a 4th-year junior. Jerez Parks is a 3rd-year sophomore coming up here. So what concerns you is that whereas you understand that Jennings and Lewis were so potentially productive anyway, that you really didn't have a place for a couple more guys at outside linebacker last year, but you would have liked to have seen at least one of the aforementioned candidates for 2020 join Jennings and Lewis as a clear-cut, top-tier, top-of-the-rotation option. That never really happened. Now, with Christopher Allen, the hope is that he is now a year and a half removed from that knee injury that cost him all of the 2018 campaign. If you remember, both he and Lewis were injured July, August of 2018. Both those guys sat out the entire 2018 season. So, that next year back, you even saw it with Terrell Lewis last year in 2019. Terrell Lewis was still very much a situational player. Now, he was a situational player that when you look at his 31 tackles last season, 11.5 of those went for loss. And he also had 16 quarterback hurries, which were the most by a UA defender since Eric Anders of MMA fame these days, Eric Anders. Since Eric Anders racked up 17 quarterback hurries in 2009. So, again, there's as much uncertainty at outside linebacker going into a March as I can recall in the Nick Saban era. Now, where the good news starts to come in is with the 3 5-stars that are already on campus to help bolster that position. Will Anderson, Chris Braswell, Drew Sanders. These are guys that will have every opportunity as early as this spring to not just sort of establish themselves as more of the situational options that we've seen younger outside linebackers fill the role of during the early stages of their careers at UA, because what typically happens is, based on how these guys are evaluated and what gets them to a place like Alabama, it starts with dynamic pass rush ability. That's the first box. That's what it's about in today's game. And so what you see are a lot of guys that have that first step twitch and explosiveness, the speed off the edge. But with that, typically is a body type that is long and rangy and essentially in need of bulk and strength. Now, I don't know if Will Anderson is necessarily that dude when it comes to lacking perhaps the physical aspects required to, as much as anything, hang in against the run, set the edge against the run. And whereas we're going to talk about pass rush production so much with this position, and understandably so, you know, the reason why Anthony Jennings, the biggest reason why Anthony Jennings started 38 of the final 39 games in which he appeared at Alabama, started with his ability to set the edge. And so that's your primary concern when you start talking about throwing first-year guys out there perhaps on an every down basis at outside linebacker. Again, though, you go watch Will Anderson's tape, and I wrote this right after the early signing period and then reemphasized it after the February signing date, of Alabama's edge signees in this class, and it's a hell of a haul. I haven't talked about Q Robinson yet. He gets on campus in the summer. Of all these guys, Anderson might rate at the top of the list in terms of being SEC ready on nearly an every down basis. He's 6'3", he's 235-ish. You watch his tape, his punch with it at the high school level especially, he was able to consistently reestablish the line of scrimmage. And it goes back to that two-way ability against the run and also as a pass rusher. And as a pass rusher, it's tough to be a one-trick pony. You know, if you're pretty much just a speed guy, the offensive tackles at this level, they're good enough to deal that one punch. If all you're going to throw them is fastballs, they're gonna start knocking those out of the park. You got to have that change up. You got to have that answer, that counter move to just speed. And Anderson, probably as much because of where he's at physically, right now I'd say he has the best chance of being able to convert speed to power, which is something that typically takes time for a lot of these outside guys. Now, Chris Braswell, he's right along that mold of some of the guys we've seen come in here in the past. Tim Williams, Christian Miller, to an extent, maybe even Terrell Lewis. Same thing for Drew Sanders, although I think Sanders physically is kind of in step with Will Anderson. Drew Sanders, if you haven't seen this guy, coming out of the state of Texas, 6'5", 235-ish, did it all in high school. Played some quarterback, played some wildcat quarterback, played some tight end, receiver, also played on the defensive side of the ball. He was a top 2 athlete prospect for the 2020 recruiting cycle. Look, if he didn't just outright prefer defense, and I think he can certainly impact Alabama on that side of the ball, especially with where the outside linebacker position sits right now. If he didn't just outright prefer defense, this is a dude at tight end could end up being along the lines of an O.J. Howard, Irv Smith in making that kind of impact, because I don't think Alabama is in dire need of an instant impact guy at tight end, because you bring back Miller Forstall, although you've got injury concerns with Miller. It's been an issue for him 2 out of the last 3 years. Alabama obviously went the grad transfer route to kind of bolster that situation at tight end. But Sanders has that kind of ability on offense. And I think defensively, this is a guy who kind of brings to mind Dante Hightower, in that he is a big dude, but he is also capable of being an inside-outside hybrid type, a cross-trainer. And I think that's something you've got the potential for now with the injection of talent that Alabama has added, not only at outside linebacker, but also at inside linebacker with a guy like DeMoy Kennedy that can do some of the cross-training stuff. So there you go. That's outside linebacker. Going to be a lot of focus on the newcomers, but certainly some returning veterans like Chris Allen with an opportunity to make a statement of their own. That's going to do it for Southern Fried Sports. As always, we appreciate Josh Smith producing the program. The lunch whistle today, Heat Pizza Bar, downtown Tuscaloosa. Get by there. Daily specials, great pies at Heat Pizza Bar. We got that all-day happy hour on Sundays. You can't beat that at Heat Pizza Bar, downtown Tuscaloosa. at Government Plaza. Until 11 a.m. on Wednesday, have a great rest of your Tuesday, everybody.